All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out this afternoon. I'm Phyllis Welliver. I'm the director of the Walter J. Ong SJ Center for Digital Humanities here at St. Louis University. And we are being, this session is being taped, just so you're aware. We're going to make it publicly available. So if you find yourselves wanting to come back and remember what was talked about or how we did it, it will be recorded and available for you. So I would like to turn the introductions over to Dr. Pauline Lee from the Department of Theological Studies, who will be introducing our speaker.
Hi, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jean Bauer, and I was able to meet her this afternoon and had a lovely conversation. She is the founder of Lemon and Eggs Data Design, a woman-owned and operated technology and management consulting firm dedicated to finding meaningful answers in messy data. Through a combination of formal training and curiosity, Dr. Bauer is an early American historian, a database designer, and a photographer. She is a graduate of the University of Chicago, her AV, and the University of Virginia, her MA and her PhD, where she developed and built the early American Foreign Service database, which she used to do analysis for her dissertation, Republicans of Letters, the Early American Foreign Service as Information Network. So Dr. Bauer was the digital humanities librarian at Brown University from 2011 to 2014, and she was the first in the country to hold that title. Following Brown, she became the first research director of the Center for Digital Humanities at Princeton University, where she is now. And she built and led a team, she builds and leads a team of programmers, project managers, and DH consultants. So today she is leading a workshop, data visualization. So please welcome Dr. Bauer.
So thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I really appreciate Phyllis for bringing me out. It's been a wonderful day of meeting with people and talking about possible futures for the Ong Center. This is one of the best parts of my new job in Lemon and Eggs, where I get to work not just with people at Princeton, which was in my former job as research director, but now I get to go around the country and elsewhere, meeting with people, hearing about how digital humanities is being fostered on individual campuses. And you guys have a great community, and there are a bunch of really amazing resources here. I'm really excited to see how this whole process develops. But today, I'm going to take a little bit of time and talk with you in a sort of, it's going to be a workshop by way of, shall we say, kind of informal lecture style, just because of the nature of the room, about data visualization. What data visualization is, and what it's not. And ways that data visualization can be useful to scholars at pretty much every part of the scholarly process, from initial testing out research ideas, through formulating arguments and publication, and also in teaching. So basically, this is going to be the 30,000-foot view, so to speak, of data visualization, because we only have 90 minutes. But I hope to spark some ideas in you, things that you may see that you would like to follow up with. You have a Center for Digital Humanities on your campus. And there is also the Reinhardt Center, which is hosting a follow-up to this event, where they'll be having an open time where people can come in, particularly around questions of data visualization in the classroom. So this is not the only time that you will have a chance to talk about this. So first off, data visualization. What is it? Well, it's a lot of different kinds of things. So this I pulled up, and due to technology, right? Gotta love it. I had a slide collapse as I discovered when I got here. So what I'm instead going to do is show you a series of tabs of the kinds of examples of things that were in my slides. So this should all work just fine. But this is a site I love. It's called Flowing Data. Some of you may already know it. It's been around a while now. There have been books, Nathan Yao, And this is just a sort of, it's an aggregator of data visualizations, good ones, often. And so if you ever sort of wonder what a thing is or how it's being used, I often find that these aggregator sites are a great way to just sort of look through. So let's see. Up at the top we have Bloomberg News with who owns the most land in the United States. We have floodwaters in the Midwest and South from the New York Times. School diversity with moving bubbles. And the goal for all of these are the kinds of visualizations that I would say, these are publication quality, or what I might even call beyond publication quality, which is to say exemplary data visualizations. They're often interactive. So if we take, for example, this one, we're actually pulling up a whole article, and then you have interaction, it's moving, and you can see as you go through the article. Now, what's most important about this kind of visualization is, in my mind, equally the text that goes along with it as the image that you are seeing. Because there's no such thing as a standalone data visualization, or at least there shouldn't be. Data visualization is often the condensation of a vast amount of information into a visual medium, which requires that people make very specific choices about what data they're going to include, how they're going to include it, how they're going to process it, and then finally how they're going to visualize it. And so if you ever see in an article or a journal or a book a sort of visualization but with no explanatory text, that's a huge red flag and is just don't do it. It's a really, really bad idea. Because the visual is not enough. It never is. And even if you have something that is intended to be self-explanatory, you at very least need to know who made that visualization, where they got their data from, can you look at their data, and how is it being deployed in this particular context. Let me go over to, this is, I've pulled up here is part of the dissertation of Ben Fry, who is a data designer, programmer, and artist. He is one half of the team that wrote the processing language, which some of you may have heard of, which is an artist sketching language designed to help people create visualizations. Well, it started out with a data visualization bent, and then it became more and more of an artist language. He and Casey Reese did this together. This is part of his PhD from the Media Lab at MIT, where he decided to define a new field, which is what all of us do in our dissertations. And he called that field computational information design. Has anyone here heard of Edward Tufte? Okay, Edward Tufte is a statistician from Yale. He wrote a book called The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, and in that book he sort of coined or popularized the idea of information design. And information design is the mathematical and artistic process of showing data. He didn't use data at the time, this is from the 80s, in a visual method. And so what Ben Fry did was he took that and he said, how do we do this with computers? And that's computational information design. And at the beginning of his dissertation, he lays out the process of data visualization. And he also just lays out why it's so hard to do. Namely, for him, there are 7 steps: acquire, parse, filter, mine, represent, refine, and interact, which is to say that you have to get the data before you can visualize it. You then need to structure your data in some way. That's the parsing. You need to filter. You need to decide of the data that you've got, what are you keeping in this visualization and what are you removing. You then want to apply methods from statistics or data mining. You then want to determine how you're going to represent the data. Are you going to make a tree? Are you going to make a graph? Are you going to do a bar chart? You then sort of refine that, and then in computational world with data visualization, you would also add interaction. And if that sounds like a lot of work, it is. And as you can see here, he identifies the fact that this comes from 4 different branches of knowledge, right? The acquiring and parsing, he says, comes from computer science. In digital humanities, it works a little differently. Sometimes the filtering and mining is math and stats. Represent and refine is graphical design. And then interact is human-computer interaction, right? So the number of people who can do all of this not only do all of it, but do all of it very well, are very few. And that's one of the reasons why information design, computational information design, is an inherently collaborative process. You should never expect only one person to be doing all of this. So if you're thinking about doing this for your own research, and you're thinking, oh my God, there's no way I could do all of that. You're right. There is no way you can do all of that. But you find other people, you work with them, and together you walk through all of this process. It's also true that there's a graphic later on where he shows that in fact it's not a straight line, right? You'll acquire the data, you'll parse the data, you'll filter the data, and then you'll go, oh wait, I actually want something else. And you go back, you acquire more data, parse, filter. You might mine it, represent it, and then go, nope, wait, I missed a step, go back. Refining brings you back around, interacting. So basically this is an iterative process, right? Just like drafting, and writing a chapter, right, is an iterative process. So is this kind of work. It's not just lockstep along the way. So when we talk about data visualization, of which I would say information design is a subset, but is not all of data visualization, we're really talking about this multi-step process. But at the core of it, and this is where the field of, or the community of digital humanities comes in, he says acquire is just like step 1. If you ever worked on a humanities project, acquiring your data is steps 1 through, 75, maybe. And as you go through the book, and this is where the field of data science relates to digital humanities, but they're not the same, because in digital humanities we are often deeply involved in the creation of our own data. So we don't so much acquire the data from somewhere. Some late 20th century historians, of which there are now starting to be late 20th century historians as we head into 2020, will have born digital records. And people who are working in new media and are working on, for example, on social media, working with the Twitter API, good luck if you're working with the Twitter API, will have born digital. But if you are a medievalist, nope. If you are an 18th century person, hello, no. Even if you are mid-20th century, you will have to have, your records will have gone through some intermediate period and process before they become digital, before you could quote unquote acquire them. And so when you talk about data visualization in a humanities context, this whole acquire, parse, filter, and even mine often come under a general heading of create. If you go to the say you're doing an archives-based project, whether it is like DigiSig, or whether here at the Young Center, John McEwen, or whether it is looking at monastery land records or something else, you go to the archive, right? So first of all, you can only acquire whatever happens to still be around. What happens to still be around that is already cataloged, or is at least in a place you can find it, even if it hasn't been cataloged yet. Then you're going to go through, you might photograph that, so that's one kind of data. Your digital surrogate, your image file, which will have technical metadata from the camera about what time you took it, where you were, the focal length. You might put a color bar next to it so you can color correct later. But then you'll also enter information. So I work primarily with letters, 18th century diplomatic correspondence, right? So I also want things like, who sent the letter, who was supposed to receive the letter, where did it go, where did it leave from, where was it headed, what were the dates involved, right? So all of that metadata. And I'm putting it into a system as I'm looking, either as I'm photographing or more likely, after you photograph for the day and then you go back to your hotel room and you type up everything before you forget. Right? So this is a sort of difference where in data science, what people are often looking for are data sets they can visualize, data sets they can play with, data sets that are large enough to test the kinds of algorithms that they are interested in for data extraction or pattern recognition. In digital humanities, it's not that there aren't data sets that are that big, but even acquiring them, working with an organization like Hathi Trust Library, there's still a lot of work that ends up getting done in terms of cleaning up the catalog records or any other kinds of information. So at this point, since we're talking about data, I'm going to take a pause, and I want you to group off in groups of, say, just turn to whoever is next to you. But let's just come back. Does anybody have a particularly fun data story that came out of your conversation, or anything that you thought was especially interesting? Feel free to plug your own work.
Okay, I
Yeah.
can share. So anyway, the three of us happened to actually work together, and one of the data sources that we talked about was social media data. So we had a project where we had to kind of synthesize the information that were posted on social media. So that was interesting, given that it was a little different because we do a lot of our data mostly from health surveys. So that was different and interesting for us. Yeah.
What were you looking for?
So it was a social media campaign, and there was a hashtag that went around. So it was focused on trying to increase awareness on HIV self-testing among young people in Nigeria. So we had to look through the different hashtags to see what people were talking about, trying to make sense of it, where those hashtags were coming from. Yeah, so it was mostly like content analysis to kind of get a sense of what information they were posting.
Yeah, so from what I'm hearing you say, you were getting the data, was it Twitter or was it?
It was Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
And Facebook, okay, wow, that's impressive. Okay, so you were getting the data, you were parsing it by the hashtags, right? And then you were probably filtering out the stuff that wasn't relevant. And I'm guessing you looped through this process
Separate times.
several times, right? Yeah. Okay, cool. Who else? Yes.
So I work in the digitization center of the library, and one of the projects...
Thank you. Everyone thank him. I'm serious.
So right now, we're working on putting the student newspaper online, which will be 100 years old next month. And several years ago, a former archivist had students go through and compile these huge spreadsheets of all of the headlines and bylines from every issue. And so the main part of my job for the last week or so has been trying to figure out a way to take all of this stuff and incorporate it into my metadata for the Content DM presentation without manually copying and pasting. I don't even want to know how many thousands of individual fields.
Yeah. Okay, right, so two different projects, two different kinds of questions. Also, it's interesting to note at this point there are also two different kinds of often data visualization or data projects. One is what I might call basically the difference between a research project and a digital library. And a digital research project and a digital library. And I don't want to push too hard on this distinction because there are many common features of both. But by and large, I would say that a digital research project, or perhaps a digital humanities project, is one in which you are doing your work to answer a particular question or a particular set of questions, right? And in the process of that work, you will generate data, you may publish that data, make it available, but it was designed, right? You know, it was acquired, parsed, filtered, and mined to help you with that question. And things that weren't relevant were removed along the way. A digital library project, you go through the same content creation steps, but the goal is for people to be able to come to the resource with whatever questions they might bring. Now, you won't be able to answer the data set or the digital library that you create won't necessarily be able to answer every question that someone brings, but you're not putting it up there to answer a particular question. You're putting it out there to make the information available so that others can use it, as opposed to, I had a question, I gathered all this data to answer it, and here is the data that helped me answer my question. Right? So when you're looking at data visualization, and particularly when you're looking at data visualization tools, this is what I might call there's a corollary here, which is the difference between what I would call tools for discovery and tools for visual argument, right? And so tools for discovery are the ones that you it's either, you know, a data mining algorithm that you throw at a huge amount of data to see if any kind of pattern pops at all. You're trying to make sense of things. A visual argument is a carefully crafted piece of rhetoric visual rhetoric, this is getting complicated. Anyway, you know what I'm saying. It is designed not to let you sort of explore wherever you want. It has a story that it wants to tell you. Now, you can read that, you can look at that, you can look at a visual argument, you can come to a different conclusion, or you can see something that the person who created it didn't intend, but the goal is to make a point or to tell a story. So when we get a little bit later onto a couple of the tools that I've seen used to good effect in classrooms, we're going to be looking at tools for creating, for doing discovery. Because the truth is that visualization discovery tools are the kinds of things that you can create and make freely available. I'm not saying that this is easy or cheap, but it can be done. And you can use them and you can find useful things in them, and then you will hit a wall if you are really interested. And you will find yourself asking questions that the tool can't answer, or wanting to represent data in a way that the tool can't, because it wasn't designed to help you tell your particular story. It was designed to help you find patterns or find things that are of interest. When you are going to look at publication quality or exemplar visualizations, you're looking at stuff that's been handmade, right? Whether it's hand-drawn, or whether it is custom coding that was done. All right. Does that make sense as a distinction? And getting back to the data, someone said the magic word, which was spreadsheet. So often when you are using free, particularly online tools or web-based tools, for visualization, data visualization, they are going to want your data in one of two formats. Either comma-separated value files or JSON files. How many people have heard of comma-separated value files, CSV? Okay, how many people have heard of JSON? Okay, I'll do a quick overview of what each of them are. Comma-separated value is basically, you can represent it as a spreadsheet. It's tabular data. So here, for example, is the data from a project I was involved in now more and more years ago at Brown. But basically, GitHub is doing a nice job of showing it as 3 different columns: basic genre, clean genre, value number. But if I show you the raw file, you'll see that it's just the indication of those different columns is that there's a comma, right? If you are doing something in Excel, first of all, if you're doing something in Excel, please rethink that. A couple reasons. Excel is very popular. Excel is very powerful. Excel is not a stable data format. Your data can get corrupted. Doesn't happen all the time, but it only has to happen to you once for you to hate yourself, the world, and everything. So it's not stable. It's a proprietary format, obviously, Microsoft, but it's also not an especially stable format. Also, if you happen to be working with any letters or numbers, any letters outside of the standard English alphabet, Excel can do strange things for no reason. So if you have diacritical marks or non-Roman characters, your chances of your data getting corrupted just went to probable. Now, this isn't an open source program, but Google Sheets is also a spreadsheet system. It now has pivot tables, for those of you familiar with those in Excel, and it is Unicode native. So if you are working in, once again, non-Roman characters, I highly recommend Google Sheets. Obviously, if you have any kind of personal health information or HIPAA regulations, do not, under any circumstances, put it into Google. In which case you may want to talk to somebody, maybe the health sciences librarian. I don't know enough about your campus to know who would be the best person to talk to about particular format options. But underneath this is basically just, this is column 1 until the comma, column 2 until the comma. There's a version of, something similar to CSV, which is TSV, tab separated values. I tend to actually prefer tab-separated values for humanities data because it often has commas in it. So for example, in my work on 18th century diplomacy, I have a lot of French aristocrats. And they have a lot of names. And those names have commas in them. And I used to have comma-separated value files. I don't anymore. Now I have tab-separated value. But the nice thing about this file is that it is just plain text. And so this is a stable format, or it's as stable as the disk on which it's stored. Store your data, back up your data, store it in multiple places. Please, back up your data, store it in multiple places. So this is CSV. JSON is, I'm going to say it's a human readable, but this is a giant JSON file. Not a giant JSON file, but it's big enough. What you're looking at is a format called GeoJSON, which I couldn't install. It's actually usually quite nicely readable, but this isn't my computer and I couldn't install a JSON validator, not validator, but formatter on it. So GeoJSON is for encoding geographic structures. And basically the way it works is that each thing, say if it was a spreadsheet, imagine each row, right, is encased in curly brackets. And then you have this value key pair, which is basically the key value pair. So the key, which is type, and then feature, or type, and then point, that key is like the column header of your spreadsheet, and sort of. And the value is what would go in that row. And this is a way of encoding complex and nested information. And this is particular for encoding geographic information. So for example, here we have a type, it's a feature, a geographic feature. What kind of geometry is it? It's a point. What are its coordinates? That's its latitude and longitude. And it has the properties, and it's got a name. Islands. This file is the location data, location and bibliographic data of every book published in the Americas before 1800, owned and held on the campus of Brown University, where I used to work. This is a project I worked on with a professor in the English department, and it grew and evolved into a number of different things, but this was the biggest thing that we worked on, and essentially what it came down to was it fuels this thing, which is a good 5+ years old at this point. So the formatting's a little off, but I'm just happy it's working, because I don't have access to this server anymore. And what this is a spatial, you can basically explore the rare book catalog through a map. And mapping is a subset of data visualization. There we could have, and I'm sure there are workshops taught on this campus for geographic information systems, GIS, which is the software and spatial statistics used by geographers, which often results in maps, but is much more than maps. And what we have here, so these are the two libraries, special collections libraries, the John Hay and the John Carter Brown. And you can click on a location, Guadalajara, for example, and here we have some sermons, and you're into the catalog. So it was another way of looking at library information. Since we are here at a Jesuit college, what we have here are yeah, here we go. So this is, these were books published in Mission area, deep into rainforest, and these were dictionaries of the Guarani language, which was a language of local people. The dictionaries were compiled by Jesuits who were there, and this was actually printed on a hand press that they carried in a cart around with them, so that once they finished the book, they could print it where they were. And if any of you have ever seen the movie The Mission, this is that. And so when I was doing the data cleaning and the visualization, speaking of acquire, parse, mine, refine, I pulled this, these got placed, and I called over to my friend who was the curator of the Latin American collection at the John Carter Brown, and I said, you have some data errors because I have got books being published in the 18th century, in the early 18th century, in the middle of the John. And he said, which ones? And I told him, and he's like, no, actually, that is the accurate place of publication. And it was one little press, and it moved around a couple places until the Jesuits were thrown out for interfering with the Spanish authorities on behalf of the populations that they had been living with, working with, and learning their languages. So, Jesuit tie-in. But this also brings us to another thing, which is when you visualize your data, and I said that data visualization is useful at every step of a research process, you find outliers. I mean, they're not here anymore because this is cleaned and this is the final website, but we also had some stuff that, you know, accidentally blanked out the latitude and longitude values, so we had some books that were published in the middle of the ocean, you know, at 0 latitude, 0 longitude, right? So we found those, went back and corrected them. Also found some books that had somehow sneaked in that were actually, you know, from Germany, right? You know, the project is just for the Americas, right? So if things are landing outside the Americas, either something is wrong with the cataloging, the original cataloging, something's wrong with our data. There are some tools that are useful for this. How many of you have ever heard of Breve out of Stanford? So the Stanford Humanities and Design Lab made this really nifty tool called Breve that takes in, you know, a CSV file, and then it looks through, well, it's telling you what it's doing, but it looks through and it guesses your data type based on what's in the column. It guesses about how much data there should be in any given cell. And then it goes and it finds, it shows you where there are gaps, and it shows you where there are probable errors. Now it's only guessing, right? But say, for example, I'm working on a data visualization project right now with another client, and she has entered in birth and death dates for a number of the people that she's researching, some of whom she doesn't know exactly when they were born or died. So in what would be a year column that would normally just have 4 integers, sometimes there are question marks, right? Now that's fine if you're just scanning through and reading it, but if you actually want to put it on a timeline or use something else, those need to either be numbers or they need to be blank. And this is the kind of thing that Breve can tell you. So it's very useful if you have, especially if someone has just handed you a giant CSV file and you suspect that there may be something very, very wrong. This is a great way, but it's a nice, elegant solution, and you can go in and you can even edit the file in the program and then re-export. So data visualization works at the point of as you are creating your data set, it's good to sort of spot check it using visualization tools like Breve. There are others for different data formats. Right. So, moving on to what makes for a good data visualization. And this is where, shall we say, reasonable people can disagree. But by and large, if what you are doing is, if you are creating a visualization, if you're creating a visual argument, right, it should tell a story, it should have a clear point. You should be able to understand what it's saying, and then there should be a nice big wad of text that explains why it's doing what it's doing and allows for the kind of nuance that you can get in prose that feels very stark, right, when you're dealing with visualization. It's a sort of interesting question about data ethics and visualization, right? I mean, here, for example, right, there is a gap, right? The program interprets that as a problem. But maybe there's just no data, so there shouldn't be any data, right? Or maybe there really should be data where there isn't. Actually, let me see if I can pull up. Dangers of live Googling. So Mimi Onohuya has this wonderful project called the Library of Missing Data Sets. And what it is, you can see here, is it's a file cabinet with file folders with headers for which there is no data. And these are things like the number of new, let's see. Actually, it's now a GitHub repository because she's created a list. And so, for example, sales and prices in the art world. Nobody collected the data. Trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crimes, with note that existing records are notably unreliable or incomplete. Undocumented immigrants currently incarcerated and or underpaid. Firm statistics on how often police arrest women for making false rape reports. Right? And her point in the art exhibit is that there are certain kinds of data that we collect as a society, and there are certain kinds of data that we don't. And thinking through, when you have gaps in your data, what is that saying? Now, for humanities scholars, when we're working with an archive, we can often get very deep into it and can start to theorize as to why there are gaps, right? When you look at some of the work that's being done now in library science around category headings and how we describe things, what we do. It's a way of noting what's important and what's not. And as our society becomes increasingly data-driven, it's important to think about what are the data sets that we don't have. There's a major one at the top. Civilians killed in encounters with police or law enforcement agency. Update, this is no longer a missing data set. The police violence report was put together by a group of activists who went through all of the news reports of people who had been killed by police over the course of 2017 and compiled that into a single spreadsheet so that you can go and look and as much information as they could get about the person killed by age and gender, race, etc. Which is what we're talking about, how great it is to have data sets and how great it is to do all this stuff, just thinking about what data we have, what data we don't, and why. So, when we think about what makes a bad data visualization, there is a term that was popularized by Edward Tufte, which is called chart junk, which he refers to as all of the stuff that is not actually giving you meaningful information that people put on their graphs. There are now, aggregators of chart junk where people go and post the worst visualizations that they've seen. They're fun in a disturbing way, right? But so, for example, a case in point, this is actually one from Tufte's book where someone did the price of diamonds with a sort of Marilyn Monroe, with where the curve is under her leg, right? And he's like, no, you don't want to do that. This is what you need. This gives you the information. You don't need the rest of this. But another thing that we have Excel to thank for are the three-dimensional bar charts, which are just confusing because now it's much harder to tell where things are as opposed to if you, looking for an example, if you line up like this. Now, as I said, with what makes a good data visualization, reasonable people can disagree. Artists have pushed back against some of what Tufte and others have said about chart junk, saying, well, there's also room for artistic license and making things memorable. But nobody's really arguing for this one, or this one. Or there was one, oh yeah, the one where the graph is the monster's teeth. Here it is again, monstrous costs. So when you're thinking about creating something, I mean, this is informative but boring, and you're not inclined to look at it very much. One of the things that Tufte does a lot is to have, let's see, there we go. So here's a good example, which Tufte calls the small multiples, right? Where what you have are these little lines, and what you can do is they're each a very simple graph, but if you line each of them one after the other for months upon months, you can start to see where trends emerge, right? So that's one way of taking very simple data and getting it multidimensional without adding a whole bunch of other information. You compare that, though, for example, with the one on floodwaters. Okay. Which is showing where the river is, where the river is supposed to be, and where the river went. These are very different kinds, and what the visualization is doing is quite nice and clever, which is that as I'm scrolling down, it's moving me through a story, and along with the specific things that you can see, like Cairo, Illinois, water stayed above flood stage for a record 156 days in a row. You also have this nice little map up here in the corner that shows you where on the Mississippi you are as you've zoomed into this detailed area. Right. So this is much more in the vein, and I'm scrolling back up again, so I'm scrolling up the river, which means that I'm going north by northwest, vaguely. So that is more an instance of, computational information design, as opposed to the small multiples, which would be characteristic of data visualization. But it's also the inclusion of maps. And mapping, as we talked about a little bit before, maps are, for visualizations, a force multiplier, right? We have a general idea of how space works, more or less. So if you take things and you put them on a map, you've suddenly given me more information both about each individual thing and its relationship to other things, right? So there is all of cartography, right, and all of GIS, but then there's also the use of maps, in data visualization. Like, for example, if we go back to the map view of the Brown Library holdings, and the John Carter Brown Library has a mandate to collect widely across the Americas up to 1800. So this is, there is a library in here that is actually trying to have a comprehensive collection. Do a double slide, you can sort of watch, right, where publishing shows up. And the interesting thing about this one is that the professor I was working with, Jim Egan, teaches colonial American literature. And what he wanted to do, working with me, when I was at the Brown Library, was to expand his students' ideas of what constituted early American literature, right? Beyond the idea, he's like, my students just think that all that was printed in colonial America were Bibles. But of course, they didn't actually print any Bibles because Bibles were quite large books and paper was very expensive. So they printed psalters and psalms and hymnals, but they didn't actually print Bibles, but they also printed a wide array of other things. And so one of the first visualizations we did, which I showed you the data from earlier, was this sort of quick genres in North American publishing from the American Antiquarian Society. We have broadsides, almanacs, and he laughed when we did this because he said, I always feel like there are never any poems. And then poems, lots and lots of poems. Also, this is a little bit the history of American publishing. It's also the history of cataloging, though, because there's this giant category down here, which is nonfiction, which I can tell you was not a colonial British term to describe printed material. So, and at a certain point, the catalogers at the American Antiquarian Society decided they were no longer going to just classify things as nonfiction. They were going to go and start breaking it out, right? So we left this one up just sort of as a fun artifact of our project, and there's, a little bit of a description. But this is also where that acquire, parse, mine, refine, right? If we had been really digging deep into this, we would have needed to hack at that very, very large bubble. All right, so I've shown you, there's just, chart junk, right? There's a problem with the data, right? And then there are extremely beautiful and powerful data visualizations. My favorites are about a year and a half ago, the Smithsonian put online, the Library of Congress put online W.B. Du Bois's data portraits of African American life in 1900 that he did with a team of sociologists black sociologists at Atlanta. And so here, what you have is a very annoying ad. But next to the very annoying ad, you have, so this is city and rural population. And what he's done here is the green are people who live in cities of over 10,000. The blue are people from cities from 5,000 to 10,000 inhabitants. The yellow is 2,500 to 5,000. And then the red is country and villages, right? So it could have been a bar chart, but this is so much better, right? And of course it's hand-colored and lettered, and they're gorgeous, and they're all up in full color, and there's also a book, an edited collection of essays by Britt Russert and a co-editor that came out talking about the history of these images and how they were created, and to what end, right? But if you want to talk about an argument, right, this is extraordinary. And there are more of them in this. This was, he showed it at the Paris Exposition of 1900. Here's the book, and I recommend. So for example, here are the proportion of, of free persons and enslaved persons among Black Americans from 1790 to 1870, right? And once again, it's a stacked chart, but the color, the sort of, and the ragged edge, and the edge of the cliff just coming down. These are striking pieces. This is art as much as it is data, but as beautiful as it is, what gives it that additional power, right, or the fact that there's data behind it, right? And that's the fascinating thing about data visualization, for me anyway, is that you create things that are beautiful and interesting to look at, but there's a whole other level underneath, and that is the data. So I should have ended on this, but I actually want to show you two things for classroom work. So one is something called RAW. And by the way, I'm going to grab all of these links and send them to Phyllis so that you can just have a record of what was being shown. So this is raw graphs, and it purports to be the missing link between spreadsheets and raw data. And they're crowdfunding, of course they are. I'll take a sample. Animal Kingdom, why not? And then you have all of these different data visualization possibilities. If any of you have heard, there's a data visualization library written in JavaScript called D3. And what RAW is it's basically a web-based data wrapper for D3. So you give it data, and then it chooses the appropriate example in and puts it out that way. But so let's just do a tree map, which is a nice way of showing hierarchies. And we'll do the kingdoms, sized by the names. Color, I'm just making this up right now. This is exactly how you do not do data visualization. Promise me you will not leave this with this. And then it will, only use numbers. I don't have any numbers. All right, fine. I will do a circular dendrogram. change. And basically, it will plop out this, and then it can go out different levels. So if you have a data set that you have prepared, you either have it from your research or you've gotten it online, and you want your students to play around and you want them to talk through the affordances of different kinds of ways of displaying information, raw is a really great way to just have them drop things in, they can play around. You can export these, this is not worth exporting obviously, but you can get out an SVG file that you can embed on a website. And it's just a nice way to play through data and you're not sure which is the best way to visualize it. You can just sort of play around and you have all of these different options. The other one that I really like is Voyant for text analysis. And you can put in a URL, you can type in, you can copy and paste text, or you can select one of their pre-made corpuses. We'll go with Austen's novels. And then it populates with a whole bunch of different ways of doing text analysis on the full corpus of Austen's novels, which here have been divided into the different novels. You have here a word cloud, which many years ago was claimed the mullet haircut of the internet, showing which are the most popular words and sizing them by popularity. This is a terrible way to do data visualization. Do not use word clouds. I mean, they're fine if you need like a poster image, but people will judge you. The problem with these is that while the font is sized, or the length is sized by the number, the words are different lengths already. So it's hard to tell which is the biggest, right? Humans are very good at estimating area under rectangles. We're terrible at estimating area under arcs, which is also why bar charts are good and pie charts are bad, because you can eyeball a bar chart and you're much more likely to get it right than a pie chart. So you get this, and then you can scroll through all the text here, and you can see different document terms. And I promised you novels as a series of bubbles. So here we go, novels as a series of bubbles. As advertised. These are the most common, right? So we have Mr. and Mrs. Miss, all of which are ones you would probably want to remove. You have a stop word, which is being auto-detected. And stop words are something that's commonly used in natural language processing, and these are just common words, right? And numbers, saying like, these are the most common words in the English language. We don't care how common they are in this text because it's not a meaningful piece of information. Now, if you're analyzing poetry, you probably don't want to use stop words because individual word choice matters a great deal more in a poem than in long format prose. If you are, so you don't always want to use them, but they are useful. There are other instances. I also think it is sort of interesting, not very interesting, because this is just a discovery tool and I just picked a random corpus and I'm not editing anything. But, Mr. comes up most often in Pride and Prejudice and in Emma. If you go down here, you get some interesting things about the document, so which is the longest, Emma. Vocabulary density, so how often are new words introduced into the corpus? Average words per sentence. Love and Friendship has an average of 25.8 words per sentence. and then most frequent words, and then distinctive words. And here, it's actually interesting to note that in all instances, the distinctive words are character names, right? So once again, this is a question of like, great, this is a very powerful analytical tool, and it's not really telling me anything useful at the moment, right? But it's a discovery tool, and you can imagine having your students throw in a single novel, or a collection of novels, articles from the New York Times. It will also grab like all of the header information and all sorts of other stuff, so there's different things to do. But this is another fun one to play with in the classroom if you want to have your students get examples of using big chunks of text. So it's 5:15, so I'm actually overdue to open the floor for questions. But I hope that this has been at least a useful, if very rapid fire, overview of data visualization and how you can use it at different stages of research for final production, and also potentially in teaching. And don't forget the Reinhardt Center is doing this open lab. Later on, there will be information.
It's on the poster.
Ah, great, it's on the poster.
So first of all, let's thank Jean. We'll have a Q&A in a minute. I'm sure there are lots of questions, maybe especially regarding what you are particularly interested in. So we'll take some time for questions. Just to follow up on what Jean said, the posters have the information about the date and time that the Reinhardt Center has an open studio. They usually like to operate with a little sign-up sheet to know what's happening, and I'll ask them to follow up. If you are interested in that, could you please, I think it's 2 weeks from today in the afternoon. Is that right? Do you want to say anything more about that?
Wednesday, October 2nd, 1 to 3. It's just a time when someone from the On Center and a couple of folks from the Reinhardt Center will be in a space together waiting for you. If you're thinking about using data visualization in teaching, it's a great opportunity to talk with folks about what that might look like. So in some ways there are data visualization questions to talk about, and in some ways there are course design and assignment design questions to talk about, and we'll have folks on hand who can kind of help you think about what that might look like.
Great, thank you. So I think get in contact with the Reinhardt Center about details. Would you like a sign up, or is it more just drop by?
Well, it's a drop in as you wish. If you know you're going to drop in, let us know. I think it's useful to know that. Otherwise, we have people sitting in a room and you're not there, and that's totally fine too. But if you want to email cttl@slu.edu, that would give us an idea that you're coming. No pressure, but we'd love to talk through the ideas with you if that's something you are interested in.
Great, thank you. And we've got a couple weeks between the two sessions because sometimes these things need a little time for you to process and think about. So let's open the floor to questions right now. Any questions? Any wonderings about how this might apply in your own work? Yeah.
So, good question. I know you mentioned that using the word cloud won't be a good idea, which I've done before. So good to know, not to do it next
I mean,
time.
it's not the end of, it's not the end of all things, but it can be confusing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So outside the bubble, because I've not seen other ways to represent qualitative data, what other recommendations do you have or would you just say explore the site to see what options?
Yeah, so exploring the site, they have great documentation. At docs.grantTools.org. Just pull this up, you can see it. Yeah, so basically, I don't know what we're doing at the moment. But basically, if you, there are tons and tons of tools. You can customize each panel to have any one of these in it. And so finding the ones that are useful. I mean, something like, it depends, like what kind of question are you just looking for sort of word frequency?
Yeah, so because then it was a brainstorming statement, so I was just trying to look at frequently occurring words. So,
Yeah, well, so, I mean, in some ways when you're doing that, just listing them down here, I mean, for your own use, right? Seeing which are the most frequent words. I find the bubble lines a little easier to read. That's a personal preference in terms of what you're using. If you're going to be publishing it, then I think probably either something like a bar chart or just listing the words is probably the best.
In English literature, I know we've made use of the chart on the far end there because there's scatter plot diagrams, and you can see outliers in corpuses. So I've loaded in all of Dickens' novels, for instance, and seen that Pickwick Papers, which was as early as, was way out on its own in terms of the types of words that were being used. And certain other novels were clustered in interesting ways. So it helped me to prove a theory I had, to put them in place like that.
thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? And remember, there was stuff on maps as well, which I know several of you were interested in.
You also have a couple weeks to think of questions.
Yeah.
And then,
Okay, well, I
God,
think-
there was a lot of information.
I
all
think
at
this
once.
was a really rich session. We still have reception food in the back here, which you are more than welcome to partake. And you can come down and talk with Jane one-on-one as well. If you are interested in talking with the Center for Digital Humanities, you can go to the website, and there is an email address there, and you can get in contact with us too. So please know that there's help on campus through the Reinhardt Center as well as the center. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.